What's up, guys? We're here at ILHQ talking about the Q Collar National Top 25 Power Rankings. Dan Kaplan, Dan Abern. Biggest news, of course, number one goes down. Malvern Prep on the road at Calvert Hall falls to the Cardinals on Friday night. Dan Kaplan, an unbelievable game. What do you got?
Yeah, it was another one of those really high intensity high school matchups to start the season that, there's just a ton of commits on both sides and a great atmosphere. Friday night under the lights and just like, you know, a potential game of the year already. I feel like we've said that multiple times at this point through March, but I do mean it, one more to add to that list.
Dan Abern, Calvert Hall now 5-0 with 3 wins in overtime, including a double overtime win over Lawrenceville. The other overtime game coming against Hill Academy. What do you think of the Cardinals?
I feel like this team's kind of built like a college team in a way. Reminds me a lot of the good Maryland teams where they have really good specialist play. I think Ben Cuomo I think he's just a fantastic faceoff guy, and he was a big reason why they beat Malvern Prep.
Totally.
And then I think like they have just athletes like Jermaine Anderson, just on his athleticism alone can really just change a game with like a big play here or there. And that was the case against Hill Academy where he basically intercepted a pass at like midfield and then just ran all the way down and scored. That it was their tying goal, and they ended up winning in overtime. And then we go ahead.
I just here to say, I feel like Maryland is the best possible example of that because right now, like if you were to talk about Maryland, it's about like how many different, producers they have. In Calvert Hall, it's not a ton of star power, but it's a lot of guys that, are like committed to mid majors or committed to schools that, aren't just like, the top of ACC of Big Tens, but a lot of guys that are just like working hard, mesh well together, understand each other's tendencies, and really want to play hard for the guy next to each other.
Yeah, and I think, Jackson Mitchell, the guy who scored the game winner, I've just been really impressed with his game over the past 2 seasons. And then Will Schoonmaker, who, if you want to understand how much Malvern respected him, look at that kind of like ill-advised triple T that they pulled on the game-winning goal. I think they just have like these guys who when they need a goal or need a big play, they have guys that they can lean on. And so I've just been really impressed with kind of like the poise and, the composure that they play with. And, 3 for 3 in overtime games against, Lawrenceville, Hill Academy. It's just like these big names. Like it's a really impressive resume for Calvert Hall. And, I think, they definitely have a shout at the number one team, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, as we sit here on Monday afternoon, we have a few more hours left to polish everything off. But as it stands, Calvert Hall would be my number one. So you guys have a little bit of time left to convince me otherwise if you think that you should.
Well, let's talk about the Friars because they're now 5-1. They've already rebounded with a win over LaSalle, a perennial Pennsylvania powerhouse, on Sunday. Where do the Friars go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's partially par for the course if you look at that schedule, right? Like very few of us thought that they were going to make it all the way through that stretch unscathed. And so in this situation, right, like that comes to fruition, but I don't think that it's a situation that it's going to be a total setback. I think it's, adversity that provides them the opportunity to be resilient, which we always knew at some point during the season was going to happen when you take on that type of a schedule.
And to speak to that, just the end of this week, they head to Taft, Loomis Chaffee, and Lawrenceville, and then cap all of that off with a game against St. Anthony's. So despite the already bouncing back, the sledding does not get any lighter for Matt McCready's team.
Yeah, and at this point, like, even though they have that loss, like, do I feel like them coming in as the preseason number one like team, does that now mean that wasn't nullified? Like, no way. I feel that was still
This is
like a little wrong.
Okay, a top 5 team in the country, elite team, just elite roster. We got to give a shout out to, Logan Turley, who had a totally on him kind of game in this one. Just kept through the bell in the fourth quarter, like with these ridiculous goals and shots. I love what I've seen from Malvern, and like I honestly can't wait for some of these games, coming up. I think, Malvern versus Lawrenceville has that game of the year potential for all of high school lacrosse. So
The story in mid-March is typically teams coming through the Mid-Atlantic and getting these high-profile kind of intra-state matchups. And then what has happened in increasing numbers in recent years are the Maryland teams immediately that heading to Florida. And that's what we've seen over the course of the last week or so. But relative to years past, whether it was the Benjamin School, St. Thomas Aquinas, or St. Andrews, the Florida schools are showing up and showing out. Dan, what have we seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty awesome. First of all, like from the clips that you can see and from the streams that you can see, like the crowds and atmosphere, like it looks awesome. So it's cool to see that like the students of those schools are really supporting the lacrosse team in a way that like I don't know that I knew was happening before. And so from that aspect, I think that that's like one cool element. But then for them to not just be competitive, but like pulling off victories in these matchups, and in certain cases, like dominating those matchups, I think is really cool for the sport. And like we've ranked a ton of players from Florida, and we've been aware of a ton of players individually from Florida over the last, few years, and we've talked about them, but I don't know that we've ever like really covered them collectively or together as, their actual high school teams, more just like individual players and from the club circuit. And so it's cool to see, just a little bit of that element coming to fruition with their actual high school teams in the spring.
If we're looking for one player who I think kind of symbolizes let's call it like the most recent rate of development for Florida, because like Jared Bernhardt played high school lacrosse in Florida, right? Like he was the number 1, 2, 3 recruit in the class like the entire way through. So having elite talent and even like great teams coming out of Florida is a decade plus old situation. But I'm really attracted to Jaden Vega's story. He is a high school quarterback who was probably in that, mid to low D1 college football opportunity, and he committed to Brown late last summer in his rising senior summer, and he's going to play both football and lacrosse at Brown. And this guy has been incredibly productive so far to start this season, and I think keeping an eye on a player like that as he develops as a senior is the type of thing that showcases, in my opinion, kind of that next stage of development for lacrosse in Florida.
The other thing I'll add to this is like when you look through a lot of the rosters for our like on the IL database, a lot of those rosters are very heavily shaded to the 25 and 26 classes because they've been through the recruiting process, or they've been to enough of the like recruiting events that we've had the opportunity to either identify them or get, those rosters up to date. But what we haven't seen a ton of is the 2027s. So if you're looking at just some of these schools or just some of these rosters in the DB, like you'd be like, oh, they have 4 or 5 commits or whatever, like not a ton of guys that are eval'd. But what they have down there is a ton of 2027 talent that we just don't know about yet. And we'll see more of over the course of the next, summer. But also right now, like it's on us to track down film, go see Benjamin while they're up here, so on and so forth, and like really work on getting a good 2027 feel out of the Florida State.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back at the last week of high school lacrosse, and there were some insane results. We already talked a little bit about that Malvern Prep Calvert Hall game, but we also have some insane results, starting with WRA and St. Paul's, which, Dan, you got to catch firsthand.
Yeah, so I think context is important for this game, and I'll set the table by saying that St. Paul's had a school trip that involved, I think, up to 15 players on the St. Paul's lacrosse team. So that included, 2 of their better players in Jackie and Antuano and Luke Bear, who I think is probably like a top 5 player in the MIAA. So they're going into that context, like they're down, they're short-staffed, so to speak. But WRA looked really dead in the water in the first half. St. Paul's came out, they led 7-1 at halftime, and it really kind of just felt like WRA was lacking energy. They came out in the third quarter completely fired up. They quickly rattled off like 3 goals and got it to like 7-4. And that's when I could kind of tell like the energy shifted in this game. They said, okay, now that's within reach. And then they get it all the way to 11-8. And I'm like, whoa, like this is crazy. And then a bunch of penalties actually happened late in the game. And I think St. Paul's was man up for the final like 3 minutes in this game, which included maybe a minute of a 6-on-4 opportunity. And so they quickly got it to 11-10. And then just Ethan Jaffe, the goalie, the second half goalie for WRA, had just an absurd performance in the final minute. 3 separate game-winning saves. I was really impressed with the energy WRA came out with, the physicality that they played with. It's a real testament to Dylan Sheridan's program. But yeah, you do wonder how like this game would have been different if some of those other players on St. Paul's were able to play, but a great victory for WRA nonetheless.
Definitely. And you also saw WRA out here in a matchup against Loyola.
Yeah, so in between that St. Paul's game and the Loyola game that I saw, the Pioneers suffered a pretty one-sided setback to Spalding, who I think has quickly emerged as one of the premier contenders for the MIAA. But the game that I saw was kind of the opposite of the one that you saw, Dan, where WRA jumped out to the early lead, and Jack Lickelmeyer, the Ohio State commit, was just physically dominant in a way that being guarded by Tyler McCautry, another Ohio State commit, it was a physical advantage that pretty clearly went to the WRA attackman early on. But the poise that Loyola played with, which is something that I've seen, or I think we've seen in multiple games so far over the course of this early season, just continued to stand out and continued to impress, particularly as they kind of chipped away at that lead. It kind of started to open the second half with a Bing Birch long pull goal in just to start the third quarter. And then little by little, they continued to, like I said, chip away. Ultimately, the game kind of hinged on a dive that went in but was waved off due to being in the crease that would have given WRA an additional goal. But ultimately, it was some of the clutch performers that we've seen from the Dons so far that ended up separating out.
I actually have a screenshot from that play that gives a pretty clear validation to the referees. So if you are on one side of that or the other, it was not a goal mouth violation, but I think there was a pretty clear foot on the line before he takes off on that one. So definitely a insane high school game, awesome matchup, a great trip out if you're WRA, where you get a couple of victories, some tight games, one where you get some lessons, but a great trip out.
I think before we kind of end on that, it's important to point out that Loyola Blakefield right now, in my opinion, is being led by a Hamilton commit and a Bowdoin commit, which is pretty remarkable. Cooper Pasco scored the game-tying goal and the game-winning goals, and that was not the first time this season that he has stepped up. And then potentially the most impressive player on the field to me was Liam Finkel, who was a really tall left-handed midfielder going to Bowdoin. And I know this is really high praise given the freshman year that he started off, but I wouldn't. The only player that comes to mind when I watch him play is Hunter Aquino at Penn State. And so, it speaks to this notion that there's talent all over and there's talent heading all these places. So if you have an opportunity to get eyes on the Dons, I think those two guys are going to stand out.
And another guy for that offense that, not a Division III guy, so maybe doesn't as much speak to that point, but I would say that the best player on that offense, the captain of that offense, is Matt Joris, who's headed to Vermont, right? And so another guy that's, Division I bound, but maybe not necessarily to, a top tier, ACC Big Ten, but is doing a ton of damage in the MIA right now.